champions, and welcome back. Mr. Chambers here, coming to read another couple chapters from Powerless by Mathew Cody. Today we are doing chapters 14 and 15. And as I said in the previous video, from here on out, with all the Powerless videos that I am doing, the only task that I'm asking of you as a scholar is to A, draw a picture of a scene from the story that I read, and B, write a short 3 to 5 sentence paragraph about the book and what Mr. Chambers read today. So, thank you for tuning in, and without further ado, let's dive into it. Powerless by Mathew Cody. Chapter 14, Journey Home. A good soak wasn't too much of a price to pay for surviving a high-speed chase with a shadowy, memory-stealing monster. Daniel was so sure that he repeated it to himself over and over again as he sloshed his way along the long road home to Elm Lane. Their landing had been rough, to say the least. It was only due to Molly's extraordinary flying that they weren't impaled on a bunch of trees or flattened against a roof. As it was, she had managed to steer their fall into Tangle Creek, skidding along the water's surface to slow their momentum until the only damage done was a record-setting splash. All that was left was the walk home. Molly was so exhausted that she could barely stand, much less fly, so Daniel helped her along, his good arm around her waist. The fact that she accepted his help at all was proof of just how worn out she was. With every step, dirty creek water squirted out of Daniel's sneakers. He looked down at his dripping cast and grimaced. Even if Daniel managed to make it home and into his bedroom without being noticed, even if he managed to hide his soggy clothes, the cast would be a dead giveaway. The mucky water of Tangle Creek had given the plaster a greenish tinge that would be impossible to hide, no matter what his bad arm would rat him out. It took a while, but eventually his one foot in front of the other strategy paid off, and they made it back to Elm Lane. Although it was a good 2 hours past his curfew, Daniel wasn't surprised to find his parents waiting for him. Daniel had expected Molly to go straight home, as her parents were probably worried as well, but instead she walked with him all the way to his front porch, where he found his father pacing back and forth. "Daniel," his father said. Daniel decided that a preemptive strategy would work best: throw himself at his father's feet and hope for mercy. "Dad, I'm sorry I'm so late, but Molly and I were taking a walk after dinner and we lost track of where we were." His father glanced at the children's damp clothing, their streaked, muddy faces. "A walk? Which lake were you walking in, exactly?" "Well, like I said, we got a little lost." "Never mind about that now. Molly, you'd better go along home. Your parents are worried sick." Something in his dad's tone bothered Daniel. He seemed distracted and much, much too calm. He should have been furious with him. At that moment, Daniel's mother appeared at the door. Her eyes were bloodshot and her face was puffy. She had been crying. "Mom," Daniel said. I'm all right. I'm okay." "Oh, honey," she said, and then went back into the house. Daniel could hear her sobbing as she went up the stairs. Bewildered, he looked back to his father, who put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Daniel, we need to talk. It's about Graham." "What?" Daniel demanded. "What about her?" His earlier fear was gone, replaced by something fiercer. He didn't even notice that he was practically shouting at his own father. "Daniel, she's gone." Daniel didn't hear what his father said after that. His world suddenly got very small. and the pounding of his own heart made him deaf to anything else. He turned back to Molly. Had she heard the same thing? Perhaps Daniel was imagining all of this, and Molly could simply punch him in the arm and tell him to snap out of it. But Molly wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. One minute she was right behind him, and the next she was gone. Chapter 15. Flowers and Casseroles. Daniel's shirt collar was overly starched and scratched against his neck, and his shoes were too tight, forcing him to keep flexing his toes so that they wouldn't fall asleep. He had already gotten rid of that awful tie, a blue and black one that he'd had to wear to church back in Philadelphia, and he wondered if it would be rude to take off his shoes as well and just walk around in his socks. There was a hole in one of them over his right pinky toe, but that shouldn't matter. A boy should be able to walk around in his own house with holes in his socks. What prevented him from doing so was that his house was full of strangers. Daniel refused to call them guests. Guests were people you invited to a party or some other kind of joyful event. But these people all came together because something awful had happened. And now they were all in Daniel's house, eating and drinking together for some reason that Daniel couldn't begin to understand. The funeral had been earlier in the day. Daniel's parents drove them out to the small church that Graham used to go to before she got sick. There was a reverend who said some nice things about Graham. Then he said a whole lot more about God and heaven and stuff. Daniel thought he spent far too much time on God and wished he'd talk a little more about Graham. But he seemed kind enough, and he shook Daniel's hand when it was over and told him to be brave. Then they drove out to the cemetery, and some more people said some more nice things. Daniel's mother started to say something, but she got too upset to talk, so his father stepped in and put his arms around her. Daniel heard her say, "Mom's gone," over and over. And this struck Daniel as strange for some reason. Graham was just Graham. He didn't think of her as someone's mom. In the same way, Daniel's mother was just Daniel's mother. He didn't think about her being someone's daughter. When they came home, everyone came with them. They all brought over food, sandwiches, potato salad, cakes and pies, and too many casseroles to count, which Daniel figured was supposed to be a nice gesture. But he wondered what they would do with all that stuff, since there was no way one family could ever eat so much. It seemed like an awfully big waste. So with a house full of strangers bearing food, Daniel found himself sitting on the back porch with Georgie, tugging at his over-starched collar. Georgie was lucky, Daniel thought. Their parents had changed him out of his nice clothes the minute they had got home. They were probably afraid that he would get them all dirty, which in fact he would have. He was sitting in the dirt right now, putting one of his favorite balls into the back of a toy truck, dumping it, and then starting all over again. He had been at it for about 20 minutes, and seemed nowhere close to quitting. When the back door opened, Daniel turned around, expecting to see another of the adults offering their condolences and some more food. But he was surprised to find a strange girl he didn't recognize standing behind the screen. She was wearing a dark dress with a lacy collar and white stockings. Her hair was done up in braids. "Are you one of my cousins?" Daniel asked. "Are you a moron?" the girl snapped back. Daniel did a double take. "Molly?" Molly came out onto the porch and let the door clang shut behind her. She sat down next to Daniel on the steps and smoothed out her skirt while tugging at her stockings. "I didn't recognize you in that dress and your hair." Not another word. Daniel said nothing, but he couldn't resist a smile. It was the first time he'd smiled in days. "My mom and dad are inside talking with your parents. They brought over a casserole and told me to see if you wanted anything to eat." Daniel rolled his eyes. "No, thanks." Rohan's here, but some woman has him cornered and won't stop pinching his cheeks. That would be my mom's great-aunt Flora. She never had any kids of her own, and well, I got the Flora treatment earlier. Daniel rubbed his left cheek. It was still sore. So, are you okay? I'm okay, answered Daniel. Then the two of them sat together for a while and watched Georgie in his dump truck. Eventually, Rohan joined them. He was wearing a smart little bow tie and a dark suit that was too big in the sleeves. That woman must be stopped, he said, rubbing the feeling back into his cheeks. She's just lucky I don't have super strength. The three of them sat on the porch and chatted about nothing for a while. Daniel had hoped that people would get tired and go home early, but instead the noise from inside the house just got louder. More people were showing up every minute, and Daniel was glad that they hadn't yet spilled out into the backyard. Eventually the conversation turned to the night at the quarry. Daniel couldn't believe that it had happened only 3 nights ago. To him it seemed like something out of another life entirely. Someone else's life. Molly had already told Rohan about the shroud and the tunnel with the solid rock door, but now was an opportunity to fill him in on the details. Molly went through their whole adventure together, play by play, while Daniel sat silently, picking up the paint peelings on the porch steps. Occasionally Molly would ask Daniel if she was getting some little detail right, and he would nod or offer a clarification. But all this was a story Daniel had no desire to be a part of again, even if it was just in its retelling. His mind was on Graham. He'd meant to spend more time with her, but there always seemed to be something else that needed doing. His friends, his superpowered friends, had needed him while his Graham got sicker and sicker. Apparently Daniel had chosen his priorities, and he had chosen wrong. Well, said Rohan after Molly was finished, I think that settles it. We need to tell Eric. Molly said nothing but looked at Daniel instead. What? He said. You guys can do whatever you want. Yeah, said Molly. I know that. But I want to know what you think. What I think is that I don't want to think about this anymore. Daniel's right, said Rohan. This isn't the time to make decisions. No, you don't understand, said Daniel, turning to look at them. I mean, I don't want to think about this ever again. This was never my business to begin with. I can't fly. I can't see mountains on the moon. And when I wake up on my 13th birthday, I'll be the same as I was the day before. Ordinary. Daniel, began Rohan. But Daniel didn't let him finish. Daniel stood and scooped Georgie into his arms. Georgie began to whine and reach for his toy truck, but Daniel ignored him. He carried him back up the steps and into the house. In the doorway, he paused and looked back once more at his friends. I'm sorry, he said, but I'm just a plain, useless kid. I can't save anybody. Then he shut the door and let the noise of the party swallow him up. Inside, Daniel walked Georgie past crowd after crowd of well-wishers offering sympathetic pats on the head. Georgie loved the extra attention, and since he was too young to understand about Grandma's death, Daniel felt as if he should be carrying little Georgie's grief around with his own. It would have been the big brotherly thing to do, but he just didn't have room for it. Daniel's own hurt was too big. He found his mother in the dining room. She was sobbing again, and a few kindly-looking old ladies were rubbing her back and handing her tissues. The whole time I just kept wishing there was something I could do, he heard her say. I just felt so damn helpless. Daniel's mother never cursed. Not even that mostly harmless word. He turned and left the dining room without letting her know that he had been there. He was on his way back to the kitchen when he saw the older man, tall and strong-looking, standing off in one corner alone. His black suit looked expensive, not like Daniel's father's rumpled, all-purpose gray one that he was wearing today. The man looked at Daniel and smiled. There was something familiar about him. He recognized the white, bearded grin that had greeted him outside of Plunkett's mansion. "Hey, Daniel," came a sudden voice from behind him. Daniel turned and saw Eric coming over to him. Eric wasn't dressed up like everyone else, and for some reason that pleased Daniel immensely. "Hey, Eric, Daniel's words were lost somewhere in his throat. Eric seemed to understand. He just nodded and put his hands on Daniel's shoulder. When he let go, Daniel looked back to where the well-dressed man had been standing, but he had disappeared. Plunkett's man, whoever he was gone. Eric picked up Georgie and bounced him in the air, to Georgie's squealing delight. "How are you holding up with all this?" Eric asked, gesturing to the crowds and the buffet tables that had invaded Daniel's home. "I'm all right, I guess. I wish there was a little less of a party. Yeah, I guess grown-ups deal with death by drinking and eating. My mom did a lot of drinking. I mean, a lot of drinking when my dad died." Daniel looked at him in shock. He'd gathered from previous conversations that Eric's dad wasn't around anymore, but he'd assumed that Eric's parents were divorced. It had never occurred to him that Eric's father might not even be alive. "Eric, I didn't know about your dad. I'm sorry." "Yeah, well, that was a long time ago. I was only 5 when he got sick. Mom tried over the years to get me a new dad. Several. But it turns out her taste in men has gotten worse and worse." "So Bob?" asked Daniel, remembering the blue Chevy parked outside his home. Eric shrugged. "Another deadbeat. My mom threw him out again last week, but he'll just come crawling back sooner or later." "How do you do it, Eric?" "Do what?" How do you deal with so much? I mean, I just lost Graham, and I'm so angry right now that Daniel stopped. He couldn't go on. Luckily, he didn't have to. "Look, it's not like I never get angry," said Eric. "Believe me, I do. Sometimes I get so angry, I scare myself. But you know, that's what being a hero is all about, right? Overcoming your fears and failures to help other people, like Johnny Noble." Eric smiled. "I know you cringe when I talk like that, but it's true." "I don't cringe," Daniel protested. "Yes, you do. So does Molly. You guys are afraid that one day I'll show up in a cape and tights, and that will be it. But the whole idea of being a superhero is not any of that. It's about being a better person. And Johnny is an example that shows me what it is to be brave. And I'm not even talking about having powers or being a super or anything. I'm just talking about being the best person that I can be. That means not giving in to anger or fear. It's what keeps me going. Even though there are people like Clay Cudgeons out there in the world, and people like Bob, all I've got is the hope that I will wake up on my 13th birthday the same as I was the day before. I can only do my best and believe that one day I'll be able to do more. The first rule: use your powers to help. Never hurt," said Daniel. "You bet your butt," said Eric with a smile. "Ball!" shouted Georgie, pointing to the front yard. "Sorry, buddy," answered Eric. "Maybe later." Eric handed Georgie back over to Daniel and looked around. "Are Rohan and Molly here? I've been trying to talk to them for days, but it's like I'm getting the cold shoulder." Last I saw, they were out back.
Oh,
And why aren't you out there with them? Daniel almost told him everything, right there and then. Plunkett, the shroud, the truth about Johnny Noble, everything. But then he thought about what Eric had said, and how his belief in Johnny kept him going every day, despite all of his troubles. And he just couldn't do it. He couldn't be the one to shatter all of Eric's dreams. Someone would probably have to be before this was all over, but it wouldn't be Daniel. Why don't you go on out there? Daniel said. I've got some stuff to do in here. They'll be glad to see you. I'm sure you all have a lot to talk about. Eric gave Daniel a skeptical look, but he let it slide. Okay, he said. I'll see you later. Sure, answered Daniel. But in truth, he wasn't sure. He just made up his mind about something. A few minutes ago, he'd been ready to throw it all in, to let the supers, his friends, struggle on their own. Thinking back on what he'd said to Molly and Rohan, he grew ashamed. After everything Eric had been through over the years, he still hadn't given up. With his power, he could have easily gone down the same path that Clay had taken. He could have become a bully or worse, and there would have been no one to stop him. But Eric decided to use his powers to help people instead, without so much as a thanks. Use your powers to help. Daniel watched as Eric headed back to the back door, grabbing a handful of white cake on his way out. Alone, Daniel looked around for the well-dressed stranger, but couldn't find him again. He had disappeared among all the little flowers that were piling up in the living room. Any space that wasn't already occupied by food was now claimed by a bouquet or potted plant. Across the crowded room, he saw that Louisa and Rose had arrived, and the two of them intercepted Eric on his way out back. Daniel couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Eric point to him, and then Louisa gave Daniel a small, sad smile. Daniel smiled back and made his way to greet the two sisters. Today he would suffer through the food and the consoling pats on the back and the awkward small talk. Because tomorrow he had a big day ahead of him. Tomorrow he was going back to Plunkett's mansion. For his friend Eric. For all of them. He would face the shroud once for all. Alone. All right, that concludes today's reading of chapter 14 and 15 of Powerless by Mathew Cody. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to me read. Your activity for this is to draw a picture of something that happened in this story and write a short 3 to 5 sentence about what happened in the reading. Thank you. Stay awesome. Talk to you later.